Read the question, explain why a government might decide to impose an indirect tax on the consumption of cigarettes. Okay, so this is a very classic market failure related question, right? So this one, very easily relatable to the actual real life society, cigarettes, right? We can decide what you're gonna write immediately, because this is a very frequently occurring question that you're able to see on IA topics and some other papers from questions you'll see from, I'll say this one, 9 out of 10, you'll see this in some sort of the form in paper 1, paper 2, paper 3, you name it. Okay, so let's look at this. Well, the first thing you're gonna do, step 1, right here, right, is to find the definitions that you need to write down. Okay, so if you look at the question here, indirect tax, right, indirect tax, you need to define this straight away. The first thing you do is definitions. Okay, definitions. So sometimes, kindly enough, they'll write down what kind of definitions you need to write. Okay, so indirect tax right here, a very kind question. They already told you. So here's a 1 mark, tick, right? How do we define indirect tax? Right, it's a tax that is imposed indirectly, right? So this is an intermediary tax that is imposed on the producers, right? But ultimately, who's paying the tax is actually the consumers, right? So those we'll have examples of per unit tax or VAT tax. Those type of taxes are considered indirect taxes. Okay, so we have definition 1 here, and if you end up just writing indirect tax definition, that's not going to get you to the full marks here. We need to try to derive a few more definitions here, right? So what can we say about the consumption of cigarettes, right? This is definitely negative externality, right? Negative externality. So you need to define negative externality, right? Externality definition, very simple, is the side effect caused by the consumption or production of a good towards the third party that was never involved in the third party transaction, right? So we're talking about the negative externality here. We have cigarettes, we have alcohol, we have air pollutions, and it goes on, the list goes on, whatever that is consumed or produced that causes negative third-party effect. Okay, so we have another point here, and as you write down the essay, whenever you try to mention a different economic concept or an idea, you must define it. Okay, if you write it down and if you don't define it, that's worse than not mentioning it at all. Okay, so all right, so step 1 is done. Step 1 is done. Very, very easy, right? Very easy, very simple. And we're gonna move on to how we're gonna structure this essay. Okay. So first step, we already have it. You write down the definition. The next thing you're gonna do is to find an appropriate graph. Okay. For this one, once again, super easy, right? You just you plot a graph, and I tell the students all the time during the exam situation, you do not need to use a ruler to draw your graph. Okay. That is probably the biggest waste of time. Don't do that. Okay. Just draw it straight enough with your bare hands, okay? It should be fine. You just got to do the right labelings here. Quantity, we have price, and you should have an appropriate title here. I'm not going to write it, okay, because we have limited time here. But here, so for externality graphs, right, you probably have covered already in your econ classes. We're going to have a similar demand-supply sort of structure here, but the labeling is different, right? So here we have marginal social benefit, right, and we have marginal social cost. But for this situation, we're dealing with a negative externality here. So what do we need to pay attention to, right? Referring back to our previous classes or previous exposure to this topic, right? Whenever there's a negative externality, the marginal social cost is below the marginal private cost, okay? So we have the graphic representation right here. So essentially what happens with cigarettes is, in most of the economies, right? So this is the socially optimal quantity and price, right? This is the socially optimal quantity and price. Quantity, socially optimal, and here's the price, socially optimal. But the problem is, as we can see on the graph here, the actual economy right now is producing at quantity, let's say quantity A, okay? And is selling at price A. So this is not good, right? Because cigarettes, obviously, it's not good, right? It causes a lot of secondhand smoking, and it's bad for the environment, bad for people's health, and it's bad for whoever's consuming it, right? But the problem is, right here, as we can see, it's producing more than the socially optimal quantity. It's actually producing a QA. So this is not optimal. As long as you draw a graph of something like this kind and do the right labeling, have a right title for it, and actually show and able to explain by writing it down what is the problem here on the graph, you should be able to get the marks that you're supposed to take it with you, okay? And one of the really common mistakes that the students make here is they really forget to label the MPC and MSC correctly, right? Because you always got to remember right here the situation, as I just walked you through a second ago, is that you're supposed to produce where MSC meets MSB, which is the point right here, okay? As you can see, we'll call this point A right here. So this is the socially optimal quantity and price that you should be producing. But as this is causing a negative externality, we can see that MPC and MSB meeting point, which is point B, this is where the economy is at right now in terms of producing cigarettes, and this is a no good, okay? And we can also see the dead weight loss occurring here, the shaded area right here. So this is dead weight loss, okay? This is dead weight loss. This is not good, okay? So this is this means allocatively not efficient and just generally not good for the society. And with this graph written down on your paper, you should be able to smoothly move on to the next part, which is evaluation, right? So all you gotta do is explain what is the appropriate action, okay? So let's look back to the question again. It says, explain why a government might decide to impose indirect tax. So you already drew a graph. The graph already shows what's the problem. All you gotta do is take a step further and kindly write it down, the reasons why a government may do so. So let's think about that. So let's write down why should government impose tax on it. Okay, right? So very simple. First of all, right, to reduce negative externality, right? Externality, and what could be other reasons be, right? To collect taxes, right? Because one of the ways, or one of the most often used method of government trying to control the consumption of a negative externality causing good is by imposing indirect taxes, right? And by imposing indirect taxes, not only it can actually move the MPC to MSC, but you can also collect a good amount of taxes that the government can use for the generated revenue, and they can spend that money on social welfare or other stuff that is beneficial to the society. Okay, so this is probably two of the most important things you need to write down. The third, if you want to write more, sure, you can go on, write the willingness to reduce health risk, right? Because generally any sort of smoking tobacco is not good for the overall population, right? So if the cancer patients increase due to cigarette smoking, that's going to be bad for the government, right? Because in the long term, they will have to spend money on social welfare and health care, and if you actually measure the amount of money that they will have to spend in the long term if they don't regulate this thing, it's unbelievably huge. Okay, so this can also be one of the motives why government wants to impose indirect tax on cigarettes. So you have three very solid reasons here that you can write down. Okay, so I'm not going to write a whole essay here, but just walking you through is a very, very simple process. Okay, we have 1, 2, 3 points. You write each one of the points down, which should be the topic sentence of your argument, and then following that, you just kindly break it down for them. Okay, kindly break it down that the motives behind this reason that you just stated, and then you move on to the next reason, then you move on to the next reason, then this part A question is pretty much done. Okay, very simple, right? And we're gonna look at part B here, which is also not difficult at all, right? As you can see, let's read this question together. Discuss the possible consequences of the imposition of an indirect tax on cigarette for the different stakeholders in the market. So this is a build-up question to the part A, right? So every question that you see on paper 1, part A, part B, they're heavily linked together. So if you answer question A in a solid manner, part B should be a piece of cake. So here, it says possible consequences. We're talking about consequences here, right? Consequences. We're talking about consequences in terms of the tax burden, right? We're talking about tax burden on each parties, right? And you know, just for a reminder, stakeholders here, right? Stakeholders, we are referring to consumers, right? You should know this off your head straight away. Producers and government. Okay, so these are the 3 parties that are concerned at this current situation. Okay, so very simple. You can talk about the tax burden and the tax incidence of who's bearing more tax and who's the winner loser of this situation. Obviously, as I just mentioned before, in terms of government's perspective, there's nothing bad about it. They collect good amount of taxes for other usage, and they can also regulate the negative externality, right? But for consumers, you can bring out the concept of elasticity of demand, right? Because tobacco, it goes the same for alcohol, right? Those are addictive goods, which means they're very inelastic, right? If you have an inelastic demand, this means that although you regulate something or you change the price of it, the demand for it is not affected as heavily compared to elastic goods, right? So in that situation, a lot of the consumers might lose out even more, right? Because that does not guarantee that they were able to stop smoking right away. In fact, that's actually going to cause them to spend more money on cigarettes, and it's going to take away their income. And what that might have an effect in the society as a whole, it's going to expand the gap between the rich and the poor, right? So those are some of the really, really solid evaluation points that you can bring up on your paper, and 10 out of 10 times, whoever that is marking your paper will be very, very impressed, okay? And second one, we can talk about the revenue on each side, okay? So in a long-term sense, right? How can the revenue grow into a different usage, okay? Because as I mentioned before, the government, not only they were able to collect the taxes, but that will indirectly somehow save them enough money in the future by able to reduce the healthcare costs, by able to reduce the social welfare costs that they would have to spend eventually in the future. So if those are saved, that might eventually comes into their part of their revenue, right? So you have a ripple effect in a long-term sort of situation. Okay, so we're talking about the consequences here, and the next point that you can do, that you can also bring up here as part of the evaluation is solutions. But obviously, it's going to be alternative solutions, right? Alternative solutions. So what are some of the alternatives that the government may be able to consider other than imposing indirect tax here? So these are very typical. It does not only apply to cigarettes or this particular question right here, but in a broad sense, a lot of the students have to remember that a lot of the questions that you bump into in every past paper that you'll be solving in the future is that a lot of the content and the materials, if you look at the mark schemes and the overall concept that it's trying to convey to you, they're pretty much the same, right? Just some of the wording changes and some of the topics they're discussing here might differ a little bit, but mostly the general structure and the general evaluation content is pretty much the same. So for solutions, we can talk about an advertisement, right? Advertisement campaign of some kind to anti-smoking, right? So we're talking about public advertisement, right? You see these on TV more and more nowadays, okay? So this can be one of the alternative solutions that we can use, replacement of indirect tax. The second one, we can talk about price floor, right? Price floor, we're going back to price control. As we study macroeconomics, right, we have price floor, which is above the equilibrium price, and we have price ceiling, which is below the equilibrium price. Okay, a lot of students get those confused, but don't get this confused. Okay, it's a very, very easy concept. You don't need to get loose marks from this. So we have, I'm talking about these two alternative solutions. There are more out there, it's just that these two will pull you through well enough in the exam situation because we're dealing with limited time, and I don't want students to write down all these ideas and they're not confident to write all of them in a perfect manner, because that's worse than not able to write 3, 4. Instead, I'll just write 1 or 2 that is very solid and that is very well explained. Okay, so we have these 2 points here. All you gotta do actually is pretty simple. All you gotta do is compare and contrast with the original solution that the question suggested, which is indirect text we're talking about here, right? So what are some of the comparisons that we can do with indirect texts? And here, another important factor that students always must keep in mind is when we're talking about alternatives in terms of keeping a contrast with the question suggested solution, is that you always gotta approach in a short run versus long run concept, okay? So this is pretty simple. All you gotta do is in the short run, this solution will have this sort of effect or consequences. In the long run, however, you will have this these type of consequences that might cancel out the short run benefits, okay? So these comparisons between short run and long run will get you enough content to write about, and also will impress the people that are marking a paper, because this shows depth, okay? So IB likes the word depth, okay? Depth. In order to have depth, short run and long run is probably the best way to kind of show that depth that you can show in a paper, especially. So for price floor, right? Price floor, I would say in the short run, you have a very immediate effect on the prices, because this basically means the government will set a legal minimum price for a certain product, right? Whereas for advertisement, this is probably a little different compared to indirect tax and price floor, which is a very immediate effects that is imposed on these goods. For advertisement, this is a very long run project, okay? In terms of long run, it's gonna take years for the advertisement to actually take place, and people will not quit smoking by looking at an advertisement, right? But if we expose them to a lot of the advertisements around them, slowly, eventually, in the long run, this will have some sort of an influence on the existing smokers, right? And advertisement in the short run, you might have a few disadvantages, right? Such as a high cost of producing an advertisement, right? So those are the initial costs that the government has to take care of, okay? So we'll call that as an investment. Okay, but the benefits, as I mentioned before, because from the government's point of view, they have a such thing called a very short-term revenue and a long-term revenue. And long-term revenues are most of the time are very implicit. Okay, they're not really explicitly gave to them. It's just the cost that they should have spent, but it could be saved for the policies they implement right now. Okay, so we're talking about short-run cost that cause the advertisement to be a little bit of a disadvantage, but in the long run, you definitely have a more long-lasting effect, right? So price floor is the same. We have a short-run effect of being very immediate, but in the long run, we'll have a surplus, right? Because in a typical price floor graph, a lot of them will be very familiar with, right? So price floor is above the equilibrium price, okay? Always have to remember that, okay? So we'll call this supply and demand. There's gonna be a surplus, right? There's always gonna be a surplus. There's gonna be more suppliers trying to supply cigarettes, and there's gonna be not many demanders demanding for cigarettes, right? So we're gonna have surplus, and this causes deadweight loss as well, and generally it takes away a lot of the consumer producer surpluses, and just overall not the best option. But definitely need to mention this, right? To show that you have ideas for other solutions, and you have your priorities, right? What do you think is the best solution available for the government or for other stakeholders, right? So, and I would like to address probably the most fundamental concept that you need to keep in mind when you're answering paper 1 questions, is that you always got to be very objective. Okay, you always got to be very objective. You don't want to dive into a certain point of view and write so heavily on it, because that kind of just takes away the objective side. Okay, you have to be very objective and walk through each of the evaluation possibilities, and then maybe you can list down some of the prioritized order, right? That you think that this probably after comparing all of them, will be the best solution available. Okay, so that's how you should end an essay in paper 1. Okay, so if you write all of these down and you get your graphs right and you get your definitions right, you will have a very, very solid paper ready for this question. And unless you make a silly mistakes such as leaving out some of the labels on the graph that it should have, or you misdefine a certain term, or the solutions part where the evaluation was not so complete or coherent, then you may be able to lose a couple of marks. But as long as you pay extra attention to these small details, I don't think there's any reason why that you should walk away with not a full mark with this kind of question. Okay, so we'll work through more question type here, but for now, this is all you need to know for this type of questions. Okay, try to write practice papers as much as you can, because I'm telling you, the time will be very short when you're in the exam situation. Okay, so it is for now, and if you have any questions, any inquiries, let me know.